Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you join us today for our event, hosted by Living on Earth Book Club in partnership with the International Fund for Animal Welfare and UMass Boston School for the Environment. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country here in Australia, their connection to land, sea and community, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Rebecca Keeble and I am the Oceania Regional Director for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or ifaw. Our mission is to help animals and people thrive together. To achieve this, we rescue, rehabilitate and release animals, and we restore and protect their natural habitats in more than 40 countries across the world. Living on Earth has been bringing us fascinating and inspiring stories and conversations on climate change and the environment for the last 30 plus years. And today's Living on Earth Book Club event promises to be as compelling as ever. Our hosts tonight are executive producer Steve Curwood and senior producer Jenni Doering. Steve is an award-winning journalist who has worked in public radio since 1979 and launched the Living on Earth series in 1990. Jenni has helped produce the show since 2014 and grew up in San Diego, California, where koalas at the San Diego Zoo help seed a fascination with nature. Koalas are an iconic species internationally, and their plight received global attention during the Black Summer bushfires here in Australia a few years ago. It was during these catastrophic fires that we sadly lost thousands of this species. As a result, ifaw commissioned research and led calls for their endangered status to be formally recognised here in Australia. And the government finally heeded those calls last year, but the work certainly doesn't stop there. ifaw's work takes a holistic approach that covers individual animal health and welfare through to habitat recovery and securing long-term protection. This can only happen by engaging all stakeholders and particularly local communities. And that's why events like these are really important, because they help raise awareness of koalas and the uncertain future that they do face. Today, we are delighted to bring you a conversation with Danielle Clode, the author of the new book, Koala, A Natural History and Uncertain Future. Danielle is an award-winning author of Australian non-fiction books, including children's books. She grew up in the fishing town of Port Lincoln in South Australia before sailing around the coast with her parents on a boat known as the Pirate Ship. After finishing school in far north Queensland, she moved to Adelaide to study politics and psychology. Danielle worked as a zookeeper before completing her doctorate in zoology at Oxford University, studying seabirds and feral mink in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. She has been a freelance writer and researcher ever since and teaches creative and academic writing across Australia. It is now my honour and pleasure to welcome our Living on Earth hosts for this event, Steve Curwood and Jenni Doering.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us. Steve and I are joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki, Abenaki, and Massachusetts. We recognize and thank their stewardship of these lands. Before we start, we wanted to remind you that we couldn't do this without your support. So if you can, please consider sending us a donation by going to loe.org and clicking on Donate at the top of the page. Even a little bit helps.
Yes, and we're very happy to have 20 signed copies of Koala, generously donated by the publisher. Here it is. You know, I'm going to have to lose one of these copies to one of you out there. To the first 20 people who donate $75. And let's just get going, Jenni. What do you say? Because we're just so excited to dive into this fascinating book, Koala, A Natural History and an Uncertain Future. So Danielle Clode is on the line now from Adelaide. Can you pop on your camera, Danielle, so we can see you?
Sure. It's just been disabled again, so...
Oh,
sorry.
let me fix that.
What happened? Oh my goodness, this just is amazing.
There's
You're
always
halfway
a little...
around the world.
Now you should be able to.
Okay, here I am. Fantastic.
Oh, all right, here we are. All right, well, Danielle, welcome to Living on Earth and joining us in this.
Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So, tell me, what tell us about the moment when you felt you were really compelled to write about koalas, to create this book. What was that moment that you said, I just have to do this? Because you've written so many other books.
Yeah, I guess I think really koalas are an animal that we take a little bit for granted as Australians. You know, they're so well known, and you see them everywhere in children's books and in toys, and that they're the face on every poster, as it were. That it kind of didn't occur to me to write about koalas initially. But I think it was definitely, the Black Summer fires, and I also had a bushfire that burnt near my, right up onto my property 2 years ago. So those kind of events and the impact that had on the local koala populations really made me sit back and think, well, this is something I need to look into in a bit more detail and really find out what's going on with koalas and just how threatened they are.
So I have to ask, koalas, of course, have such a cuddly image. They're the most adorable creatures, but it's not really true that they're cuddly. Is that right?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because koalas can be cuddly, when they're in care. Some of them can be, some of them aren't. It depends on the personality of the animal. But they can also be, they're also, they are a wild animal, and they can be quite belligerent at times and definitely prefer to be left on their own. So as far as wild animals go, they're fairly amiable in nature, but nonetheless, they've got some big claws and sharp teeth, so you do have to be careful with them.
Have you ever...
Wait a second. I just want to hug them. I mean, they just look so cuddly.
Yeah. I think koalas would prefer to hug a tree than to hug a person, to be quite honest.
Have you ever had an unfortunate brush with koalas, Danielle?
No, I've not had. Well, I guess personally, I haven't. My daughter had an unfortunate brush with a koala on a camping trip when she was young. She'd been waiting in line for a slice of special chocolate cake on the camping trip, and it was the last slice of chocolate cake that she got, and she went to sit down and eat it, only to have a trickle from the tree above fall right onto her chocolate cake and the koala weed on her chocolate cake, and she's never forgiven koalas for that.
And we said we weren't going to ask you about koalas peeing on you, but here we are.
Straight in there.
Yeah, right in there. It was in our editorial meeting. But Danielle, what is it about this adorable face? Why do we respond so strongly to them?
I think that there's a lot of things about koalas that really appeal very directly to us. It says more about us than it does about koalas. They have that forward-facing features. The very face looking like a human face with the eyes and nose, which is very different from a lot of animals that have a more elongated muzzle kind of face. So we, as primates, are particularly primed. We have special nerve cells that pick up on facial features, and so we're very, very primed to see faces, and koalas really trigger that in us, I think. They're also small. They do look cuddly. They have a they have a way of moving and a way of hanging on to things that reminds us of small children. So they are toddler sized. They appear to cling to you like a toddler does. So they're like a young primate to us. They make crying noises that trigger a very maternal response. If you've ever heard a young koala crying, you just want to pick it up, and very often they will actually lift their arms up, when they're seeking assistance. So they really tap into those sort of parental responses we have. They're very good at that, and they're fluffy and cute as well. That doesn't hurt either.
So, all right. So they are wild animals. We should approach them with caution, with respect. But you also write about koalas' need for touch. Can you tell us a little bit about that instinct they have?
Yeah, I guess I was interested in exploring the perceptual world of the koala and really trying to get a sense of how they perceive the world. So I spent quite a lot of time trying to, think about about how that, the role the ears play, the long distance listening, the sense of smell, how that's used, the vision, what kind of vision they have, what they can see, what they can't see. So just really trying to get into, because we tend to see things through our own eyes as primates, and we're a very different animal to them. So touch came into that though, because koalas have very sensitive fingers. They have fingerprints like us, which seem to also be related to touch. And nobody's really thought very much about that. So I was kind of interested in that. And young koalas certainly have a need for touch, which reminds me very much of primates, that primate babies need to cling to their mothers, and koalas definitely do that too. And they have quite a long childhood. So they're quite known for that, needing to hang on to things. And when koalas have been in a hospital or in a vet, they've discovered that if you give them a log, so they give them a towel log, so it's like a rolled up blanket, so that when they wake up, they have something to hang on to. That obviously makes them feel very secure, because it's like being in a tree. So they have a need to hang on, not necessarily just to other koalas or people, but to trees in particular. So they really like to have a grip on things, I think.
Mm.
I'm still just wondering what happened evolutionarily here, because all those things you listed, the forward-facing eyes and snout, the ability to grab, the size of a toddler, the arms that go up. I mean, you got to wonder. I mean, if this were some sort of a show about magic, we'd say that some human line of humans got transformed into koalas for good or ill. But obviously, you just have to wonder what happens in evolution. So, but to be serious for a moment, let's turn to their diet, which is another thing that's just as intriguing in some respects as their the desire they create within us to anthropomorphize them. I mean, eucalyptus is toxic at the end of the day, and yet they pretty much live on it. I mean, how do they extract most of what they need from this essentially toxic plant?
Well, that's true, but, we should know all about eating toxic things. We love chilies and coffee and all those things that are full of toxins. So the koalas aren't alone in that.
Touché.
I guess the koalas have managed to exploit a resource that is very abundant in Australia. Eucalypts are our dominant tree type. So they're the predominant tree of the forests that we have here. And they are difficult for animals to exploit, especially mammals, because their leaves are very tough and fibrous. And they're also got a lot of toxins in them, you're right. And they have specific toxins that make mammals feel sick, generally. So they'll make them feel nauseous. So koalas have evolved a really complex system, not only of digesting the fibrous food, which is something they would have in common with other herbivores, like sheep and cattle also have these incredibly complicated stomachs with microbes and other microbial bacteria and things to help them digest their food. But koalas have the added issue of the toxins, and they have a supercharged liver for dealing with toxins. So they actually have a double dose of the genes that animals use to remove toxins from the feed they eat. And it's so effective that koalas are actually also extremely resistant to medications. So this makes them really difficult to treat in hospital. So if they have chlamydia, which is a disease koalas commonly suffer from, a dose of medication to treat chlamydia in a human might take 3 days of antibiotics. The same dose in the much smaller koala takes 30 days to have an effect, because they're so good at taking those. So that gives you a good example of how good they are at taking those toxins out of their food.
Wow.
And, interesting. So, what about the feeding of the young? I mean, they're marsupials, I guess.
Yep, that's right.
As you write. And and your line is they're like jelly bean size when they're born or something?
Yeah, so must,
And
yeah,
but
must.
how does? I'm sorry, we're having a little bit of latency on my line here. I'm sorry. So how can the mother koala turn off the normal digestive system for the koalas to get the microbes that they're going to need ultimately to digest those leaves?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that I guess the first thing is that koalas are marsupials, so they are very different from other eutherian or placental mammals like us. They give birth to tiny little jelly bean-sized babies that crawl up into the pouch, and then they have like a second external pregnancy almost. So the babies grow inside the pouch and are attached to.
Are there breakout rooms?
Attached to the nipples.
You're on mute, so I can't really hear.
So you've got a bit of interference there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes. There's actually a whole class at the University of Massachusetts watching you.
The issue around how they transfer. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. No worries. So the way in which the koalas transfer their babies from a milk diet onto a leaf diet is quite interesting and tricky because before they're weaned, baby koalas will fiddle with leaves and sort of play with them, but they don't try and eat them. They seem to know that that's not something they can do. But at some point, the mother koala actually ejects a special soup for the baby, which is it's the contents of a part of the digestive system called the cecum, which in humans that's the appendix, but in koalas it's a much larger organ. Our appendix is only about the size of our thumb, and theirs is a meter and a half long. So that she ejects that microbial soup, and the baby koala eats that soup, which is
delicious.
A pretty messy, disgusting looking thing, it has to be said. There's no other way for it to be described. It's quite horrifying, really. But the baby koalas just love it. They can't get enough of it. And that gives them the microbes they need to digest the eucalypts. And otherwise the eucalypts would remain toxic to them and they would never be able to survive on that diet. So it inoculates them and it gives them the digestive materials they need, not only to digest eucalypts generally, but quite probably to digest the specific eucalypts that are in the forest they're in, because there's 900 species of eucalypts in Australia, and all of them have different toxins and different chemical structures that the koalas have to digest. So the koalas have to have a special approach to the different species that they digest, and they are adapted to the ones that they're accustomed to in their forest for sure.
Yeah, you wrote about in your book how that can be a bit of a problem for zoos that are trying to take care of koalas from different places, and they have to be aware of what the eucalyptus leaves that they're feeding them, where those are from.
Yeah, because it's not. So there's about 70 species of eucalypt that are known to be eaten by koalas, and any one individual koala will only eat between 3 and 10 different species. So they're quite specialised on particular trees, and if you move them from one area to the other, you might be moving them to an area with the wrong sort of trees. But not only that, they're also specific about which individual trees they'll eat. So some trees are more toxic than others, even when they're the same species. And it seems to change by season and by day, and you really can't be sure whether a koala might be eating leaves off a particular tree quite happily and then suddenly go, no, I don't like that anymore, I'm not eating that. So you can really, it's up to the koala to decide what's edible for it. And that's what makes them so difficult to keep in zoos. They are one of the most expensive animals to keep in zoos, especially overseas, because their dietary requirements are so specific. You can't feed them pellets or a bit of bale of hay like you can other herbivores. They have to have fresh gum leaves, they have to have a lot of fresh gum leaves, and they have to have a really wide choice of gum leaves. Otherwise you can end up with a koala that's eating, but it will just waste away and die because it's not getting the nutrients it needs.
Oh, no, you're disappointing Jenny because she's from the San Diego area originally. And, there are lots of eucalyptus trees in California here in the States. But apparently, Jenny, I guess they're not the ones and you call them joeys, huh? It's interesting that you call them, they can, or what were you going to say? You're going to give us another nickname?
No, all joeys, all marsupial babies are called joeys. So,
okay, great.
That's just a blanket term. But San Diego is a really interesting area because San Diego was the first place to really successfully establish koala colony overseas, and probably the reason for that is because they have a big area of eucalypts that had been planted earlier, brought over from Australia and planted in that area. So they already had a good stock of feed trees, but they have to have a special eucalypt plantation to support their koalas.
I wonder if those are the eucalyptus you're seeing when you fly into San Diego, and usually it'll be on the right, and you'd see Balboa Park in the zoo, and you see all those eucalyptus trees there.
Yeah, they do have. I know they have some. They have more than one. So I think they have one really big one where the trees are actually like fence post size because they just coppice them. They cut them back and harvest from them. So they look quite unusual. They don't look like normal eucalypt trees.
Wow. So not for the koalas to climb, not those ones.
No, no, not those.
So Danielle, there's kind of a stereotype that koalas are really cute, but maybe not the brightest animals. How would you respond to that?
Wait a second. No allusions to the dumb blonde stuff that goes around in our society.
Yeah.
You can be cute and smart, can't you?
Absolutely, you can indeed.
Legally Blonde, best movie ever. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think there's certainly a very strong, narrative going around that koalas are not very bright, and in fact, there's a bit of a myth that marsupials are not very bright, and I think that this sort of there's a lot of Northern Hemisphere old world bias going on there. I think as European explorers extended out over the world, they typically were a bit derogatory about species. In America, European scientists were quite rude about American wildlife and said that it was degenerate and lesser than the stuff in Europe. And the same thing applies when, Europeans moved down to Australia. So marsupials were seen as primitive, maladapted and stupid. And I think that's, that's just simply not true. They're extremely well adapted. And marsupials, if we look at their brain sizes and all of those sorts of features, we find that they're pretty average. Brain size varies with body size, and marsupials do exactly the same thing as lots of other species. The ones that are off the scale are actually the primates. So we have unusually large brains and unusually flexible cognitive capacities for sure. So we're a bit weird. Everything else is fairly standard. And koalas... Originally, there was a report that koalas had a very small brain that actually rattled around inside their skull, which is a quite bizarre idea. And it probably comes from pickled specimens, so ones that have been preserved in a jar and, sent overseas. And the brains shrink in the preserving fluid, so that's why. But if you look at fresh koalas or even they've done MRI studies now of koalas, the brains are perfectly normal size for their skull and normal size for their body. So, but I think the other thing that makes people think that they're a bit stupid is that they sleep a lot. So, and that leads to this myth that koalas also sleep a lot because they eat toxic eucalypt leaves, and that has some sort of bad effect on their brain or their health, or even makes them stoned. People will say that they're drugged out. They're all myths. The koalas are definitely not stoned. They just like relaxing, and it's the same as your dog or your cat. If you give it plenty of food, your dog or your cat will spend a lot of time asleep because it can. It's got a comfy bed, a nice house, lots of food, doesn't need to worry about predators, and that's exactly what the koalas are doing. They're up a tree, they're fairly safe. They've got food all around them. If they've got their meals for the day sorted, they can just sit back, relax, they eat their meal, and then they sit back and digest and have a snooze. I mean, it's a perfect life, I think.
Sounds like it.
Sounds like it might be fun, but the way you tell their stories, it's quite complicated. Their environment, they have to find the right kind of eucalyptus tree, even the right time of day, and figure out exactly where stuff is. I mean, they're actually, the way you write about them, they're far from dumb.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on that we maybe don't give them as much credit for. How they find the trees they want to feed on. Is it random? Are they just roaming around the forest, bumping into the right tree, or is it a bit more? Do they have some sort of cognitive map? We don't really know, but obviously they're very good at it. They're very good at finding their dispersed food supply, so they have to range over quite a large area. So to support one koala, you need a forest the size of an average sports field. So they have a very big habitat range that they need to provide them with enough food to sustain them over the long haul. And in arid areas, it's even bigger. It could be one koala per an area the size of Central Park. So,
Oh my!
Yeah,
That's like 2 square miles,
Yeah,
or a square mile and a half. And speaking of awareness, there's this great scene in your book about a canoe and a koala. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, it was a really interesting, some students were up on the River Murray and they noticed a koala stuck in a tree. So they very, very sensibly, it was shallow water, so they just swung the canoe around so that it was touching the tree, and the koala watched what they were doing, climbed down into the canoe, and then just sat very comfortably until they swung the canoe around so that it was touching the bank, and then it hopped out and went on its way. And it was just a really interesting little piece of behavior, that it was quite clear the koala was watching what the humans were doing. It was responding to what they were doing. It had some element of foresight about predicting what these other animals would do in relation to it, which is not all that surprising when you think about an animal that lives up a tree and it has to decide whether something on the ground is going to come up their tree or go up a different tree. So that kind of predicting other animals' behaviour is obviously going to be a part of their natural world. But I guess we just don't often think about koalas in those terms.
Right. And I'm kind of surprised it wasn't really afraid of your students as they came up in this canoe.
Koalas don't... It's an interesting thing. If you watch a koala, very often you see them in parks where, in the city where I live, and people will be moving around the tree having a look at them, and you'll often notice that the koala just surreptitiously moves to the other side of the branch. I'm just going to stay just slightly out of sight, So they do move away from people, but they also like to keep an eye on you. So they'll often be on the other side of the branch but peeking around the corner. So there's a sort of a push me pull you kind of effect going on there. They like to keep an eye on people, but it's not uncommon. When koalas get very hot and thirsty, they certainly are not averse to coming up to people, and people will offer them water. So they don't have a strong flight response, I suppose. They do have a move away response, but they don't run away like a deer or something like that.
Yeah, and by the way, when you tell the story in this book, and spoiler, not a spoiler, just, hey, go to page 138 to read this. You say, if you've ever had to rescue a pet from an awkward place, a cat up a tree, a dog stuck in a drain, or a horse trapped in a fence, you'll know that they very rarely show any inkling that your actions might assist them, let alone cooperate with you. And yet this koala seemed to do both.
Yeah, that's what I mean about them having a slightly unusual response to humans, because even animals who are very humanized will often struggle with that cognitive idea that what you're going to do is going to help them. And koalas do seem to pick up on that. I don't quite have an explanation for it, but they do seem to be quite willing to accept human assistance to get them where they want to go, whether that's opening a door or putting out a bucket of water for them to drink from, or assisting them in some way. Then they're just a calm animal generally, not a flighty, panicky animal, and that assists them in those situations to perhaps take better advantage of the opportunities that are available than other animals that are a bit more flighty do.
So Danielle, not only are koalas born the size of a jelly bean, but I never knew, and I was fascinated to learn in your book, that they have this arduous journey after they're born. Can you just walk us through this process? They're born, what happens next, and how do they grow from there?
Yeah, so when koalas, like most marsupials, when they're born, they are tiny little pink jelly bean things. They're little more than a mouth and a pair of front legs. Their back legs are not developed at all, hardly at all. So they've really just got a mouth and the big front legs that are going to climb up through the mother's fur. So the baby is born, and the baby then crawls up the fur on the mother's belly up into the opening of the pouch and into the pouch. So that's quite a big job for a small little jelly bean thing.
Yeah.
Their eyes aren't open or any of that sort of stuff. So they crawl in, and then they attach to the nipple, and they're permanent. They stay attached. They're really locked on. It's quite hard to remove them from the nipple. So they're really difficult to remove. So I think that marsupial reproduction is an amazing phenomenon. I just think we really missed out on the reproductive stakes as placental eutherian mammals. I think having an external pouch to grow your baby in is just a fabulous idea.
Sounds a lot less painful.
Exactly. And you can pop them back in again as well afterwards, even after they've emerged from the pouch, they still keep popping back in, and really handy place to carry them.
How do they know which way to go when they're crawling up? They just have basically two front limbs and a head. How do they know where they're headed?
I think that's got to be pure instinct, that one. They haven't got much on their mind. They're just heading in one direction, and they go up. I think sometimes the mothers assist them a little bit, at least in kangaroos and stuff. They lick the fur and make it a bit easier for them. But generally that's just what they do.
The astonishing number in this narrative about the birth of these and development of these koalas is the size, the amount of growth. I mean, so we have an 8-pound baby. I suppose I should say we should talk about a 4-kilo baby for you Aussies, right?
Yeah.
And so that and as an adult, that 4-kilo baby becomes what? Am I getting this wrong? At 80 kilos, is that right? Maybe it's a chubby person at 80 kilos, or yeah. But these koalas go how many times? What's the multiplier for their size?
Yeah,
I mean, it was like thousands. It said.
I think what we really have to think about is what's happening in marsupials is that they're just having the birth process a lot earlier, but the development process is much the same. So basically the koala babies are born, they go into the pouch, and then they continue the development in the pouch. So think about the pouch as like an external pregnancy. So the baby stays quite contained in the pouch, isn't visible at all, doesn't come out at all until it's quite a lot older, and then the baby will emerge, and that's kind of the equivalent of our time of when we would give birth. So really they're just putting the baby into an external, instead of an internal uterus, they're putting it into an external pouch and finishing the development process there. So they are quite similar, they're just happening in different places.
So Danielle, how did koalas figure into the culture of the hundreds of different Indigenous peoples of Australia traditionally and today?
Yeah, koalas are a really important species in the dreaming stories of Indigenous Australians. So the stories of the ancestral beings that created, the country and have an important role in cultural life. And particularly on the East Coast, obviously, because that's where the koala populations are strongest. And a lot of them are around. It's really interesting, actually. A lot of the stories reflect past climate change events. So at a time when the sea levels rose dramatically, and koalas often feature as an animal that came and rescued humans and helped them get to safety on the land when the sea levels rose. So these stories are really interesting because they actually reflect very ancient geological events, and they tell us that these stories have been preserved for a very long time, for 7,000 or 8,000 years, which is a remarkable length of time to preserve a story in a known event. But they have a lot of other meanings as well, and it's difficult for a non-Indigenous person to discuss them because the levels of meaning are different depending on the level of knowledge you have in that community. So some of it's secret, some of it's public. So we can only really discuss the public stories. But they teach us about environment. They teach us about, there's stories about koalas throwing their boomerang into the sky to get the sky trees to release seeds to make the forest. So they really, most of the stories are teaching us about balance in nature and how to restore balance by listening to the country and listening to the animals. And there's a really lovely story about Indigenous relationships with koalas, where when people are walking through the forest and they're wondering, deciding which path to take, if they see a koala, they'll stop and they'll listen to the koala and get the advice of the koala, get the koala to tell them where they should be going. And there's a lot of things you could unpack in that, but I really like that idea of slowing down and taking a bit of koala time and taking your time to make decisions and think about where you are and what your place is in the environment and how you fit in. I think that's great advice, really.
Wow. So listen to the koalas or watch the koalas. Maybe pay attention when the koala hops out of the front of your canoe to see where it's going. There might be something very interesting there.
That's right.
And then came a time when Europeans came to Australia. What did the European colonizers think of these fuzzy creatures when they encountered them?
Well, surprisingly, they didn't notice them to start with, and it's not really clear whether there just weren't so many around the area where first settlement occurred in Australia, or they just weren't paying attention. But it took them a while before koalas really came to European attention, and they weren't even really that interested in them as scientists, which is unusual because, European scientists were fascinated by kangaroos and platypus and all these other strange animals, but they just didn't really think much of koalas. So it took a long time before they really started to get studied or understood. And I think it really wasn't until they came to commercial attention that interest really geared up, and that was in the late 1800s and early 1900s when the fur trade really was firing up, and koala hunting was a huge thing. So we had a huge number of pelts of Australian animals, including koalas, being shipped to the US and UK fur markets. And that really started galvanizing concern in the local community about koalas going extinct.
Yeah. You write in your book about the koala fur was maybe even being used along with some other marsupial fur in children's toys, making a stuffed koala like a teddy bear. And this was around the time when teddy bears were becoming popular as well. And they were using koala fur in some cases.
Yeah, it's a pretty horrific thought. I mean, I do remember having a genuine fur koala toy. I suspect it was rabbit or kangaroo fur, but even so, the idea of having a toy koala made out of actual koala fur is pretty horrifying. But I think that it's interesting. The children's toys then became part of a movement, a conservation movement, which was really prompted by, this is a really good example. It's a classic Australian book, Blinky Bill, by Dorothy Wall. And this is really a book that really teaches kids about koalas and really sends a really good conservation message. You know, it's about koalas being displaced out of their habitat. It's about the interactions with humans, the threats they face, and how they, you know, survive. I mean, it's also a really fun story about a naughty little koala, but it's, you know, but
Well, if they're smart, they have to be naughty at some point. Come
that's
on.
right. That's right. So, but those children's writers who wrote about koalas for children were one of the really big galvanizing public campaigns to protect koalas, and were really important in that process of making people care about koalas. And I think that's really been the case ever since. This is where the passion for koalas has come from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember before we connected with you, as we were getting ready, I remember as a kid seeing in the 60s maybe these stuffed animals, these stuffed koalas that were, you know, soft and cuddly to the touch. I think I'm glad that I didn't know that they quite possibly might have had real koala fur at the time. So if I saw them, you saw them, there must have been an awful lot of them. They must have killed a lot of koalas back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, that was really in the early 1900s. So there wouldn't have been. I don't think there's any. I don't know that there's any surviving toy koalas made of that fur. So we just know that they were meant to be around. But fortunately, really, it was actually really interesting that although there was a lot of public campaigns to stop koala hunting, it continued right up until 1930. And the thing that stopped it was that the conservationists made an appeal to Herbert Hoover, the American president, because he had lived in Australia and had a particular fondness for Australia, and they appealed to him to do something about the koala hunting, and he banned the importation of fur from Australia. And that dried up the trade and stopped the hunting. So American conservation efforts have really played a very important role in koala conservation in Australia. And even today, zoo programs like San Diego Zoo, when they have endangered animals in their collections, they have to put a certain percentage of their proceeds into in situ conservation in the country of origin. And Australian conservation programs for koalas benefit significantly from that.
So let's talk about the habitat situation for koalas. You know, what's happened over time, and of course if anyone was paying attention to the news a summer ago, the Australia summer ago, the horrific fires and pictures of koalas and, you know, sort of treed by flame and horrible body counts. But what's the situation for koala habitat now? Even with all those wildfires. I mean, or another way to ask the question, Danielle, is what's the risk of extinction from habitat loss for these animals today?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Obviously, Australia, like a lot of places, has lost a lot of forest cover. So, you know, we have cut down a lot of our forests, and in some areas we're continuing to clear land of native vegetation and native forests. So, in those areas in Queensland and New South Wales in particular are still struggling to bring land clearance under control. Technically, we're not supposed to be clearing native vegetation, but there's an awful lot of exemptions and loopholes in that. So that definitely plays a big role in the problems koalas face, particularly on the east coast. So koala populations are declining quite precipitously and quite worryingly along the east coast, and that's why they've been declared endangered in those areas. In other areas, though, they are actually increasing. So in Victoria, in the south, where they almost went extinct through hunting in the early 1900s, they have come back through a translocation program. So they, a population that was rescued and put on an island happened to breed extremely well, and those koalas have now been repopulated back into forested areas elsewhere through Victoria, and it's a very strong population. And the same thing has happened in South Australia. They've been relocated back into areas of South Australia where I live, and those populations are booming, and we have more koalas per area where I live in the Adelaide Hills than in any other part of the country. So it's really quite remarkable. But I guess that what that tells us in both cases, what that tells us is some of the problems we have with fragmentation of habitat. So, you know, on the East Coast, you have fragmented habitats. So koalas are trapped in forested areas. They don't have areas to move out to. They can't disperse. They can't maintain their populations. They have disease problems, you know, through close proximity, as we know, when we're stuck in a small area, disease transmission's a problem. Yeah. They face a lot of other threats. And in the south, where we have a lot of koalas, for various reasons, they're still in fragmented habitats. So even though they're doing really well, they have nowhere to go, and we have overpopulation problems. So we actually have koalas eating out the forest that they live in and killing the forest. So you have sort of opposite problems, but they're caused probably by similar things. And that's the fragmentation of habitat and the loss of habitat. So if we don't protect the habitat, if we don't expand the habitat that we have removed, and particularly in key areas, unfortunately, koalas and humans both like to live in the same areas. They like living in the lush, moist river valleys. So that's where, you know, housing developments tend to go in. So our needs are conflicting with the koalas' needs, and we need to find ways of making sure that when we are doing developments, we make sure they're wildlife friendly. We put corridors in, we protect, you know, we make sure the roads don't fragment the habitat, that the animals can move across them. So there's a lot of challenges. They're not insurmountable, but we do need to make a much more consistent effort to actually fixing the problems, because we've known about these problems for decades now, and we haven't actually implemented the solutions, and that's the problem.
Yeah, it's the story with so many different conservation issues. Is fragmentation is such a problem in terms of the genetic diversity, in terms of populations being able to link up and support each other. We have a listener question, Danielle, from Emily, about where the name koala comes from.
Oh, yes, that's a good question. Koala is an Indigenous word, so it comes from Dharawal language. And it's quite corrupted. It's probably not what the original word was. It's said to mean does not drink. So it reflects the fact that koalas are able to get a lot of their water from the moisture in the leaves. They do drink, but they don't need to do it an awful lot. So I think that's where the name was. So it was transcribed in the early days as Kalawa. I think is probably the closest I can come to in the original language. But it's become koala.
We have another listener question who talks about the pervasiveness of toxins and pollutants, and koalas have such dietary sensitivity. And then, of course, as temperatures rise, pests and such migrate, which affect the populations of species that prey upon them and make that vegetation more susceptible to invasive species. To cut to the chase, to what extent are koalas now under the gun from invasive species for either their food supply or that part of the biome that they occupy?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question. They're certainly under threat from dogs. Dogs certainly have a big impact on koalas. The koalas are quite vulnerable when they're moving between trees, especially if they're carrying a joey. So, you know, breeding koalas can be vulnerable to dog attack, and that's a major cause of mortality. I guess in terms of climate change, it's not so much for Australia. It's not so much pollution. I don't think that's the particular issue. So much as changes in climate, increasing drought. So if we have increasing levels of drought, the toxin levels in the trees will rise, and that might push some of the forests over the limit in terms of the amount of nutrition the koalas are able to get from the tree versus the amount of effort they have to expend in, you know, getting rid of the toxins. So it's a very close nutritional balance for koalas, how much effort to get the food they need and process it. Some trees, if they're a little bit too toxic, the koala actually loses energy by eating that species. So, which is an amazing thing. It's not a simple matter of it passing through. They actually lose nutrients through that process. So potentially climate change could directly change the balance of the toxin levels in the trees, which is a worry. And of course, bushfires are increasing, which causes an additional problem because the forests are highly flammable in Australia. They're the areas that burn. So, and if we've only got small areas of forest left and those patches burn, there's no other food for the koalas to access, and no reservoir patches for species to colonize from, and that's when extinction really happens in local areas.
There's another listener who has what I find an very interesting question about the feral camels in Australia, because I guess there's quite a few of them. They're out in the desert country, and they're wild. Do they present any issue at all to the koalas?
Not to the koalas. Australia has an amazing diversity of feral animals to contend with. You know, we have buffalo, goats, camels, horses, pigs. There's an extraordinary range of animals that do a huge amount of damage especially in those sort of arid zones. Camels are probably the least damaging. It's not to say they don't have an impact, but compared to the goats and all of those other animals, they're a soft-footed animal, so they have they do less erosion. I'm not sure that those particular animals have a big impact on the koalas. Koalas really just need their trees. So as long as it's not upsetting the trees, they're fine. Logging has a bigger impact and farming has a much bigger impact on koalas because you lose the trees.
Well, Danielle, what can be done to protect koalas now? What do you see on the horizon for them at this point?
Look, I think one of the main things I got out of doing this research and looking at them across the whole country and back into their prehistory and their evolutionary history as well is just how resilient and robust koalas are. They have come back from multiple near extinction events in their history, not just the hunting, but also, the Ice Age extinction event that wiped out a lot of the megafauna around the world. So, they're a really, really resilient animal species. And if koalas are struggling the way they are on the East Coast, I suggest that means we're doing something really dramatically wrong. So, they're very far from being the most endangered species Australia has. But the fact that they're declining so dramatically is really worrying. And I think it suggests that we do need to completely shift our focus in how we run our economies and manage our development and how we live with the world. And we do need to find a more compatible, more sustainable way of living with a stronger environmental foundation, which is better for us and also better for koalas and all the other species.
We're just about out of time here, Danielle, but we've failed. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to correct this failure now, because part of the joy of reading your book is your literary style. You have a way with the pen that some people really enjoy. To have the prose, verge on the edge of poetry at times. So, in honor of this, I'd like you to read. Do you have a copy of your book handy there?
I do.
I'm sorry, I should have asked at the beginning. Yes. So the American edition on page 58, there's a lovely passage where you paint a picture of a koala in a eucalyptus forest.
Sure.
Do you see it? It begins at the top.
At the top, yes. At the top of the tallest tree, the koala is enveloped in a curtain of greenery, surrounded by the quiet hum of insects and the occasional discordant shriek of parrots. It has no reason to look beyond its immediate surroundings. The canopy stretches unchanging from horizon to horizon in a mosaic of olive, grey, blue, green. This forested realm seems endless, sweeping down the foothills, carpeting the plains where the darkened tracks of rivers drain vein-like into valleys, before meandering across the lowlands into the open expanse of water beyond. Above the forest rise granite mountains, the igneous backbone of the eastern seaboard from north to south. The peaks frost white and snow gums entwine over open grass and heathlands. Shallow sphagnum bogs rest between submerged boulders tucked beneath mossy blankets under frigid skies. The koala rarely ventures up into the cold mountain forests. It lives on the lower slopes where the tall forests reign, a kingdom of eucalypts, ash, box, bloodwood, messmate and manna, ironbark and peppermint. Monuments to photosynthetic power, the glory of chlorophyll, 200 tons of biomass rising in smooth organic grey obelisks, 20, 50, 100 metres high, conjured miraculously from carbon dioxide and water, the invisible and the transparent, made mountainous by sheer solar radiance.
You almost have the koala there as a Buddha, observing it all.
Indeed. I like that.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you for taking the time with us today. It's a marvelous, fascinating book for anyone who's curious about koalas or thinking about giving one a hug. Jenni?
Thank you so much, Danielle. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for having me. It's been marvelous. Thanks very much.
And I think Rebecca's going to come back
Rebecca?
on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was incredible. And to Jenni and Steve for hosting such an engaging conversation as well. And everyone that's joined for participating as well and sharing those questions. It really has highlighted the threats that this incredible species is under. And it's incumbent on everyone around the world to ensure the conservation of this species long into the future. So thank you so much. If you did enjoy this program and you want to hear more about and learn more about what ifaw does here in Australia to protect koalas, you can head over to our website, which is ifaw.org, and see what we do here for koalas and also wildlife around the world. Wanted to say a huge thanks to our fellow presentation partners today, the Living on Earth Book Club and the UMass Boston School for the Environment. And also to remind you all that the team is sending copies of Danielle's book, Koala, to the first 20 people who can donate $75 or more to support events like this one. So if you enjoyed the event and you wanted to have more science stories, hear more about this incredible work, please consider donating to Living on Earth at loe.org or in a survey that's going to pop up shortly. Thank you all for joining and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye for now.